Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I would like to make a statement on the Panama Papers. Dealing with my own circumstances first, yesterday I published all the information in my tax returns, not just for the last year, but for the last 6 years. I've also given additional information about money inherited and given to me by my family, so people can see the sources of income that I have. My salary, the benefit in kind of living in number 10 Downing Street, the support my wife and I have received as leader of the Conservative Party, the renting out of our London home, the interest on the savings that I have. Since 2010, I've not owned any shares or any investments. The publication of a Prime Minister's tax information in this way is unprecedented, but I think it is the right thing to do. But let me be clear, I'm not suggesting that this should apply to all MPs. The Chancellor has today published information on his tax return in a similar way to the Shadow Chancellor and the First Minister for Scotland. Now, this begs the question of how far the publication of tax information should go. Mr. Speaker, I think there's a strong case for the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition and for the Chancellor and Shadow Chancellor, because they are people who are, or who wish to be, responsible for the nation's finances. As for MPs, we already have robust rules on members' interests and their declaration, and I believe that's the model we should continue to follow. We should think carefully before abandoning completely all taxpayer confidentiality in this House, as some have suggested. If this were to come in for MPs, people would also ask for a similar approach for those who ask us questions, those who run large public services or lead local government, or indeed those who edit the news programmes or newspapers. I think this would be a very big step for our country. It certainly shouldn't take place without a long and thoughtful debate, and it is not the approach that I would recommend. Mr. Speaker, let me deal specifically with the shares my wife and I held in an investment fund or unit trust called Blairmore Holdings, set up by my late father. The fund was registered with the UK's Inland Revenue from the beginning. It was properly audited and an annual return was submitted to the Inland Revenue every year. Its share price was listed in the Financial Times. It wasn't a family trust, it was a commercial investment fund for any investor to buy units in. UK investors paid all the same taxes as with any other share, including income tax on the dividends every year. Mr. Speaker, there have been some deeply hurtful and profoundly untrue allegations made against my father. And I want to, if the House will let me put the record straight, this investment fund was set up overseas in the first place because it was going to be trading predominantly in dollar securities. So like very many other commercial investment funds, it made sense to be set up inside one of the main centres of dollar trading. There are thousands of these investment funds and many millions of people in Britain who own shares, many of whom hold them through investment funds or unit trusts. Such funds, including those listed outside the UK, are included in the pension funds of local government, most of Britain's largest companies, and indeed even some trade unions. Even a quick look shows that the BBC, the Mirror Group, Guardian newspapers, and to pick one council entirely at random, Islington, all have these sorts of overseas investments. And to give one further example, the Trade Union Fund Managers Limited, based in Congress House. They have a portfolio of over 50 million of investment in the Trade Union Unit Trust, with 3% of their net assets based in Jersey. This is not to criticise what they do. It is to make the point that this is an entirely standard practice, and it is not to avoid tax. Mr. Speaker, one of the country's leading tax lawyers, Graham Aronson QC, has stated unequivocally that this was, and I quote, a perfectly normal type of collective investment fund. Mr. Speaker, this is the man who led the expert study group that developed the general anti-abuse rules so much debated and demanded in this House, which Parliament finally enacted in 2013. He also chaired the 1997 examination of tax avoidance by the Tax Law Review Committee. He has said that it would be, and I quote, quite wrong to describe the establishment of such funds as tax avoidance, and further that it would, and I quote, be utterly ridiculous to suggest that establishing or investing in such funds would involve abusive tax avoidance. That is why getting rid of unit trusts and other such investment funds that are listed overseas has not been part of any Labour policy review, any Conservative Party policy review, or any sensible proposals for addressing tax evasion or aggressive tax avoidance. Now, surely it is said investors in these funds benefit from them being set up in jurisdictions with low or no taxes. Again, this is a misunderstanding. Unit trusts do not exist to make profit for themselves, but for the holders of the units, and those holders pay tax. And if they're UK citizens, they pay full UK taxes. Mr. Speaker, it is right to tighten the law and change the culture around investment to further outlaw tax evasion and to discourage aggressive tax avoidance. But as we do so, we should differentiate between schemes designed to artificially reduce tax and those that are encouraging investment. Mr. Speaker, this is a government and this should be a country that believes in aspiration and wealth creation. So we should defend the right of every British citizen to make money lawfully. Aspiration and wealth creation are not somehow dirty words. They are the key engines of growth and prosperity in our country, and we must always support those who want to own shares and make investments to support their families. Now, some people have asked, if this trust was legitimate, why did you sell your shares in January 2010? Mr. Speaker, I sold all the shares in my portfolio that year because I didn't want any issues about conflicts of interest. I did not want anyone to be able to suggest that as Prime Minister I had any other agendas or vested interests. Selling all my shares was the simplest and clearest way that I could do that. Now, there are strict rules in this House for the registration of shareholdings. I've followed them in full. The Labour Party has said it will refer me to the Commissioner for Parliamentary Standards. I've already given her the relevant information, and if there is more she believes that I should say, I am very happy to say it. Mr. Speaker, I accept all of the criticisms for not responding more quickly to these issues last week. But as I've said, I was angry about the way my father's memory was being traduced. I know he was a hard-working man and a wonderful dad, and I'm proud of everything he did to build a business and provide for his family. Mr. Speaker, on the issue of inheritance tax, there is an established system in this country. Far from people being embarrassed about passing things to their children, like wanting to keep a family home within the family, I believe it's a natural human instinct and something that should be encouraged. And as for parents passing money to their children while they're still alive, it is something the tax rules fully recognise. Many parents want to help their children when they buy their first car, get a deposit for their first home, or face the costs of starting a family. It's entirely natural that parents should want to do these things, and again, it's something that we should not just defend, but we should proudly support. Mr. Speaker, let me turn to the Panama Papers and the actions that this government is taking to deal with tax evasion, aggressive tax avoidance and international corruption more broadly. Mr. Speaker, when this government came into office, there were foreigners not paying capital gains tax when selling their UK homes. There were private equity managers paying a lower rate of tax than the people who cleaned their offices. And there were rich home buyers getting away without paying stamp duty because houses were enveloped within companies. We have put an end to all of these things. In the last Parliament alone, we made an unprecedented 40 tax changes to close loopholes that raised £12 billion. And in this Parliament, we will legislate for more than 25 further measures forecast to raise £16 billion by 2021. No British government, Labour or Conservative, has ever taken so much robust action in this area. Through my chairmanship of the G8 at the summit at Lough Erne in 2013, I put tax, trade and transparency on the global agenda and sought agreement on a global standard for the automatic exchange of information over who pays taxes and where. Mr. Speaker, many said it would never happen, but today 129 jurisdictions have committed to implementing the international standard for exchange of tax information on request, and over 95 jurisdictions have committed to implementing the new Global Common Reporting Standard on tax transparency. Under this new standard, we will receive information on accounts of UK taxpayers in all these jurisdictions. And in June this year, Mr. Speaker, Britain will become the first country in the G20 to have a public register of beneficial ownership, so everyone can see who really owns and controls each company. This government is also consulting on requiring foreign companies that own property or bid on public contracts also to provide their beneficial ownership information. And we're happy to offer technical support and assistance to any of the devolved administrations also considering these measures. But as the revelations in the Panama Papers have made clear, we need to go even further. So, Mr. Speaker, we're taking 3 additional measures to make it harder for people to hide the proceeds of corruption offshore, to make sure that those who smooth the way can no longer get away with it, and to investigate wrongdoing. But first, let me deal with our Crown dependencies and our overseas territories that function as financial centres. They have already agreed to exchange taxpayer financial account information automatically and will begin doing so from this September. That never happened before I became Prime Minister and got them around the Cabinet table and said to them, this must happen. But we do need to go further. So, Mr. Speaker, today I can tell the House that we've now agreed that they will provide UK law enforcement and tax agencies with full access to information on the beneficial ownership of companies. We've finalised arrangements with all of them except Anguilla and Guernsey, both of which we believe will follow in the coming days and months. So for the first time, UK police and law enforcement will be able to see exactly who really owns and controls every company incorporated in these territories: Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, Isle of Man, Jersey, the lot. This is the result of a sustained campaign building on the progress we made at the G8, and I welcome the commitment of the governments of these territories to work with us and implement these arrangements. And the House should note that this will place our overseas territories and Crown dependencies well ahead of many other similar jurisdictions, but also, crucially, ahead of many of our major international partners, including some states in the United States of America. Next month, we will seek to go further still, using our anti-corruption summit to encourage consensus not just on exchanging information, but actually on publishing information, putting it into the public domain, as we're doing here in the UK. Because we want everyone with a stake in fighting corruption, from law enforcement, civil society to the media, to be able to use this data and help us to root out and deter wrongdoing. Next, we'll take another major step forward in dealing with those who facilitate corruption. Under current legislation, it is difficult to prosecute a company that assists with tax evasion, but we're going to change that. So we will legislate this year for a new criminal offence to apply to corporations who fail to prevent their representatives from criminally facilitating tax evasion. Finally, we're providing initial new funding of up to £10 million for a new cross-agency task force to swiftly analyse all the information that's been made available from Panama and to take rapid action. Mr. Speaker, the task force would include analysts, compliance specialists and investigators from across HMRC, the National Crime Agency, the Serious Fraud Office and the Financial Conduct Authority. Mr. Speaker, this government will continue to lead the international agenda to crack down on tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance. This battle is important and it needs to be combined with the approach we take in this country. Low tax rates, but taxes that people and businesses have to pay. That is how we'll both tackle these issues and build a strong economy that can fund the public services that we need. It is that strong economy, creating jobs, rewarding aspiration, that is the true focus of this government, and something that would never be safe under the party opposite. And I commend this statement to the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I thank the Prime Minister for the advanced sight of his statement. It is absolutely a masterclass in the art of distraction. I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister will join me in welcoming the outstanding journalism that has gone into exposing the scandal of destructive global tax avoidance revealed by the Panama Papers. What they have driven home, Mr. Speaker, is what many people have increasingly felt. There is now one rule for the super-rich and another for the rest. I'm honestly not sure, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister fully appreciates the anger that is out there over this injustice. How can it be right that street cleaners, teaching assistants and nurses work and pay their taxes, yet some at the top think the rules simply don't apply to them? What has been revealed in the past week goes far beyond what the Prime Minister has called his private matters. There are 6 questions that he needs to answer today to the House and perhaps equally importantly to the public as a whole. Firstly, why he chose not to declare his offshore tax haven investment in the House of Commons Register of Interests. There is a requirement to provide information of any pecuniary interest which might reasonably be thought to influence his or her actions. The Prime Minister said he thinks he mishandled the events of the past week. Does he now realise how he mishandled his own non-declaration 6 years ago when he decided not to register an offshore tax haven investment from which he has personally benefited? Secondly, can he clarify to the House and the public when he sold his stake in Blairmore Holdings in 2010, he also disposed of another offshore investment at that time, in particular whether any of the £72,000 shares he sold were held in offshore tax havens? Mr. Speaker, the Ministerial Code states that ministers must ensure that no conflict arises or could reasonably be perceived to arise between their public duties and their private interests, financial or otherwise, and that all ministers must provide a full list of all interests which might be thought to give rise to a conflict, including close family interests. So, did the Prime Minister provide the Permanent Secretary with an account of his offshore interests? And if not, didn't he realise he had a clear obligation to do so, when part of his personal wealth was tied up in offshore tax havens? And he is now making policy decisions that had a direct bearing on their operation. For example, in 2013, the Prime Minister wrote to the President of the European Council opposing central public registers of beneficial ownership of offshore trusts. So thirdly, does the Prime Minister now accept that transparency of beneficial ownership must be extended to offshore trusts? The Panama-based law firm Mossack Fonseca registered more than 100,000 secret firms in the British Virgin Islands. Mr. Speaker, it's a scandal that UK overseas territories registered over half the shell companies set up by Mossack Fonseca. The truth is that the UK is at the heart of the global tax avoidance industry. It's a national scandal and it's got to end. Last year, Mr. Speaker, this government opposed the EU Tax Commissioner Pierre Moscovici's blacklist of 30 uncooperative tax havens. That blacklist included the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. So my fourth question is, will the Prime Minister now stop blocking European Commission plans for a blacklist of tax havens? Because it turns out that Lord Blencathra, the former Conservative Home Office Minister, was absolutely right when he wrote to the Cayman Islands government in 2014 to reassure them that our Prime Minister was making a purely political gesture about cracking down on tax havens at the G8. It was designed, he said, and I quote, to be a false initiative which will divert other member states from pursuing their agenda. Last June, Treasury officials lobbied Brussels not to take action against Bermuda's tax secrecy. According to the European Union's Transparency Register, the tech giant Google has no fewer than 10 employees lobbying Brussels. Bermuda is the tax haven favoured by Google to channel billions in profits. And Conservative MEPs have been instructed on 6 occasions since the beginning of last year to vote against action to clamp down on aggressive tax avoidance. This is a party incapable of taking serious, internationally coordinated action to tackle tax dodging. Across the country and on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, there is a thirst for decisive action against global tax avoidance scams that suck revenues out of our public services while ordinary taxpayers have to foot the bill. It undermines public trust in business, politics and public life. It can and must be brought to an end. The Prime Minister's announcement today about new measures to make companies liable for employees who facilitate tax cheating is welcome, but it's also too little too late. In fact, it was announced by the former Chief Secretary of the Treasury a year ago. People want a government that acts on behalf of those who pay their taxes, not those who dodge their taxes in offshore tax havens. Yesterday, my friend, the Shadow Chancellor, set out a clear plan for transparency. And he is a member of this House who has spent all of his time in Parliament exposing tax havens and tax avoidance. And his paper included calling for an immediate public inquiry into the Panama Papers revelations to establish the harm done to our tax revenues and to bring forward serious proposals for reform. So I say gently to the Prime Minister, a tax task force reporting to the Chancellor and the Home Secretaries, both members of a party funded by donors implicated in the Panama leaks, will neither be independent nor credible. So will the Prime Minister back a credible and independent public inquiry into the abuses of the leaks? Our tax transparency plan also called for a specialised tax enforcement unit, properly resourced, Mr. Speaker, and that has to be the key. Since 2010, there have only been 11 prosecutions over offshore tax evasion, a situation the Public Accounts Committee described as woefully inadequate. Having slashed resources and cut 14,000 staff since 2010, will the Prime Minister today guarantee that resourcing to Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs will increase in this Parliament? Mr. Speaker, we support real action to end the abuses that allow the wealthy to dodge the rules that the rest of us have to follow. We need to ensure that trust and fairness are restored to our tax system and our politics. End the sense and the reality that there is one rule for the richest and another for everybody else. The Prime Minister has attacked tax dodging as immoral, but he clearly failed to give a full account of his own involvement in offshore tax havens until this week, or to take essential action, or to take essential action to clean up the system, whilst at the same time blocking wider efforts to do so. There are clear steps that can be taken to bring tax havens and tax dodging under control.
Order. There's a minister standing at the bar, shrieking in an absurd manner. He must calm himself, take a medicament if required, or leave the chamber. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I suggest, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's record, particularly over the past week, show the public no longer has the trust in him to deal with these matters. Does he realise why people are so angry? Does he realise, do members opposite realise why people are so angry? We've gone through 6 years of crushing austerity. Families lining up at food banks to feed their children. Disabled people losing their benefits. Elderly care cut and slashed. Living standards going down. Much of this could have been avoided if our country hadn't been ripped off by the super rich refusing to pay their taxes. I say this to the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. Ordinary people in the country simply won't stand for this anymore. They want real justice. They want the wealthy to pay their share of tax like they pay when they work hard all the time.
Prime Minister!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, let me join the right honourable gentleman in congratulating the journalists who have broken this story about this huge cache of information from the Panama Papers. I think what matters now is that information is shared with tax authorities, including here in the United Kingdom, so that action can be taken. Now, the right honourable gentleman accused me of a distraction. I have to say, I think the biggest distraction today has been waiting for the right honourable gentleman's tax return, which we finally got, I think, published at about 3:35 after this session had begun. How incredibly convenient that no one could scrutinise. No one can scrutinise it. Now, let me answer each and every one of the questions that he said. First of all, He asked whether we would resource Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs with the right amount of money. We put £1.8 billion into various initiatives since 2010 to make sure they have the resources to find this money. First point. Second point, he asked me about my register of members' interests. I've complied with every aspect of the register of members' interests, and even before the Labour Party complaint has arrived at the Commissioner's door, I provided her with all of the necessary information. Third question, he asked me when I made the sale of these shares. I sold the Blairmore shares in January. I sold everything else in June. Next, he asked me whether I shared a list of these shares with the Cabinet Secretary, which was quite difficult because I had sold them. But I sat down with the Cabinet Secretary and went through all of my interests, all of my connections, all of my friendships, all of my family, as all ministers are advised to do. So you have a proper conversation with the Cabinet Secretary in that way. Fourth, I think, question was, why were we not extending the beneficial ownership of companies to the beneficial ownership of trusts? The reason here is we want international action to take place. And the very clear advice I got was that if we included trusts in our initiative, we would not get any international action done. And this government has done more than any other to lead the world and make cooperation happen. Now he asks about the tax task force where HMRC, the Serious Crime Office and others are going to be investigating all of the information coming out of Panama. They have operational independence. If they find people to prosecute, prosecute them. If they find information of illegality, act on it. They are independent operationally, and that is exactly what they will do. They are reporting to the Home Secretary and the Chancellor because we want to make sure that radical action is taken. But they have total operational independence, and if the Shadow Chancellor is questioning the professionalism of the Inland Revenue, of the National Crime Agency, of the Serious Fraud Office, he shouldn't be doing that. Finally, let me answer the last question, which is the action we have taken about the overseas territories and the Crown dependencies. No government has done more to encourage them to take part in exchanging information, reporting tax information, and making sure that they give us the information on beneficial ownership. The leader of the Labour Party has suggested that we should force them. How is he going to force them? What is he going to do? Have we finally found a potential Prime Minister who wants to give Argentina back, give the Falkland Islands back to Argentina and invade Gibraltar? Is that what it's come to? What I would say is what we've seen from the Labour Party is we've seen their true colours when it comes to inheritance tax. If you want to pass your home to your children, they will tax it. If you want to help your children, they're going to tax it. We've seen their true colours. They're the enemy of aspiration, the enemy of families who want to support each other. And that's the real lesson of today.
Well, I was going to call the chair of the Treasury Select Committee, but the honourable gentleman's toddling out of the chamber, so...
What if you'd like to call me?
No, let's hear Mr. Tyree. Get in there, man.
Thank you very much.
What a customer I am. Order! I'm sure it'll be worth waiting for. Mr. Tyree.
It's very, very good of you to give me the floor, Mr. Speaker. I don't think the Prime Minister has done anything wrong. Except possibly to comment on the Jimmy Carr case. Tax evasion is illegal and should be very vigorously pursued, if necessary with criminal prosecution and imprisonment. Tax avoidance is not illegal. If the government or parliament don't like it, there's no point in moralising. Does the Prime Minister agree that to deal with tax avoidance, we need reform to close the loopholes and vigorous tax simplification to ensure that there are fewer of them?
Well, I'm very glad that my right friend was detained before leaving the chamber. Look, I think he's absolutely right. Tax evasion is illegal, and tax avoidance, if the government disapproves of it, should be legislated against. And that is the approach that we've taken. But what I've said before, and I'm very happy to say again, is there are some practices of very aggressive tax avoidance that I think do merit proper questions and then legislative action. And to be fair to Jimmy Carr, as soon as it was pointed out that he was in a scheme to artificially reduce his income, he immediately changed his arrangements. And he made that very clear, and I pay tribute to him for doing that.
Sir Angus Robertson.
Speaker, may I begin by welcoming the Prime Minister's statement, the new measures contained in it to deal with tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance, the publication of his tax information, and indeed for his apology for the way that he's handled it. It's estimated that between 21 and 32 trillion dollars of private financial wealth is located untaxed or lightly taxed in tax havens around the world. Illicit cross-border financial flows, Mr. Speaker, are estimated at more than $1 trillion per year. That's 10 times more than the global foreign aid budgets combined. The Panama Papers leak is so large that if one printed the file, the final document would be 650 million pages long. It's right that a special task force has been set up to go through this information that has been leaked. As the Prime Minister said, and he's right to say this, hopefully charges will follow if criminality can be proven. But the public are indignant here and they are indignant around the world. People are rightly angered by the different rules for normal taxpayers and a small, ultra-rich elite. But we have to ask ourselves, all of us, whether the scale of the problem has been taken seriously, because quite patently it has not been thus far, either domestically or internationally. And the UK bears a particular responsibility, given that the UK and its overseas territories and dependencies collectively sit at the top of the financial secrecy index of the tax justice network. In Scotland, we are confronted by the reality of a small number of landowners owning huge swathes of the country, many through tax havens. From Perthshire to Jura and across Scotland, land is owned through intransparent firms based in tax havens like Panama and the British Virgin Islands. May I ask the Prime Minister the following specific questions? Will he revisit, please, will he revisit his decision not to fully cooperate with European Union partners on overseas trusts? On the welcome register of beneficial owners across the British Crown dependencies and overseas territories, specific question. Who will this be available to and when? Will it be publicly available? And if not, why not? Will the Prime Minister prioritise bilateral tax treaties with Panama and other tax havens as part of global efforts to better coordinate against tax avoidance? And will he regularly update this House on progress? And lastly, Mr. Speaker, given it is the UK Cabinet that agrees government policy on tax rules, on potential loopholes and arrangements with tax havens, will the Prime Minister ensure that all of his Cabinet colleagues, all of them, confirm whether they have ever benefited through offshore financial dealings?
First of all, let me agree with the right honourable gentleman that there's no doubt that in some of these jurisdictions and countries there are some very bad things that are happening in terms of the hiding of assets, the hiding of wealth, the avoidance of tax, and that is why we want our authorities to go through everything they can to recover that money. But just because those bad things are happening, it does not mean we should condemn unit trusts that many investors, as I've said, pension funds, local government pension funds, trade union pension funds, who knows, even the pension fund of this House might well use as a totally legitimate way of investing and then paying tax. I think I'd make that point. He says we need as many charges, criminal charges, as possible. I, of course, agree with that, but we shouldn't do down the civil action and the civil penalties that the Revenue and Customs take. They've got 1,100 cases going through. They can charge up to 300% of the money. On the issue, he said, have we taken this agenda far enough? Frankly, I would say this is the first country in the G7, in the G20, to make tax and transparency the #1 issue at a G8 or a G20. No one had done it before. We've now done it, and it's permanently on the agenda, and you see these permanent improvements. I don't think he's being fair on the Crown dependencies and the overseas territories. I think for years there was a reputational and a potentially real problem. They have done a huge amount to address that. They're now better placed than other similar jurisdictions, and as I said, there are states in the United States of America that have less disclosure and less transparency than they do. So let's not be unfair on Crown dependencies and overseas territories that certainly on this this side of the House, we're proud that they're part of our family of nations. In terms of Scottish trusts and transparency, we're very happy to work with and help the devolved administrations in every way we can. Again, we're happy to work with and are working with European partners on the issue of trusts. The point I was making is we would not have made any progress on beneficial ownership if we included trusts in that debate in the G8. But we did make progress for the reason we give. In terms of the beneficial ownership information in the Crown dependencies and overseas territories, he's asking who will it be available to. It will initially be available to law enforcement agencies, including our own, crucially. They are not producing public registers yet. I want them to, but let's be frank, there's only about 3 countries in the world, including Britain now, that have these public ownership registers. And if we had tried to push that onto the Crown dependencies straight away, I think we would not have got nearly as far as we have got today. In terms of tax treaties, I'm keen we sign as many as possible. And in terms of cabinet ministers, no. I think the current rules for registering members' interests are right. But as I've said, in the case of prime ministers and chancellors, we are going further.
John Redwood.
According to the official ABR forecasts, we are likely to lose $7.3 billion of tax revenue to multinational companies over the ensuing 5 years because they will sue us in court and get the European Court of Justice to overturn the taxes we wish to impose, with another $35 billion at risk. What can we do here to make sure those companies pay their fair amounts, which this Parliament wants, but the ECJ doesn't?
Well, we took a whole series of actions in the budget, and of course we have the diverted profit tax, which is a tremendous weapon for making sure these companies pay their tax in the jurisdictions where they are rightly earning the money. And I think this tool of being able to exchange tax information and having a common reporting standard, which is what we set off in train in 2013, that will make the biggest difference.
Meg Hillier.
Speaker, one of the main benefits of the journalism that uncovered the Panama Papers was that it shone sunlight to areas that some people didn't want it to go. The Prime Minister makes great play that his government has done a great deal to improve corporate tax transparency, but it's nowhere near enough. When is he going to step up and make sure that corporates can publish their tax information so that everybody, the public, can see where tax is being paid?
Well, what I'd say to the Honourable Lady is, look, I'm not saying we have a perfect record, but I think this government has done more than any previous government to make this happen. But I will answer her very directly. Look, of course, our system is based on full disclosure by companies to the revenue, but a basic deal of taxpayer confidentiality between companies and the revenue. That is the way our system and most other systems work. And that's why the common reporting standards and the exchange of information between tax jurisdictions is so important, to make sure these companies are telling the truth to us and telling the truth to other jurisdictions. And it's only when that happens that we'll be able to recover the money.
Sir Eric Pickle.
The beneficial ownership register that comes on place in just over 6 weeks' time, plus the announcement that the Prime Minister has made with regard to Crown dependencies and the new Criminal Act, will do much to deal with tax evasion. But if the House will forgive me, it will do far more to ensure that the proceeds of crime, the proceeds of terrorism, can't be laundered through this jurisdiction, and that's something to be welcomed. But I have to tell that the Prime Minister has been, I think I should tick him off a little bit, which is this. I know, personally, that we would not have got the agreement with the Crown dependencies without his personal intervention and without him being very tough. And he should be congratulated on that. And just fancy, it was actually delivered without a single shot being fired or the Leader of the Opposition putting boots on the ground.
What he will remember from his time in government, and he's doing a brilliant job as my anti-corruption lead, and what we did was we got the Crown dependencies and the overseas territories around the table in the Cabinet room. I think it was actually at the same day as the Trooping of the Colour, and said we have to make these changes. You don't have to go all the way to publishing registers, although that's what we'd like. We've got to make this information available. And as he says, that will mean not only more tax paid, but also greater ability to uncover corruption.
This is Margaret Hodge.
Prime Minister some questions about his welcome announcement in relation to Crown dependencies. Can I ask him firstly whether it is right that the British Virgin Islands, Bermuda and Cayman Islands have agreed to compile a register of beneficial ownership? Can I ask him secondly whether HMRC will have access to that register? And can I ask him thirdly whether, if he does not succeed in getting those territories to publish to publicly publish those registers, he will use his powers through the Privy Council to order the tax havens to publish them.
There are basically three things we've been asking the Crown dependencies to do. One is to exchange tax information. The second is to have a common reporting standard, and the third is to establish registers of beneficial ownership. They have now done all three. So the answer to the first question, have they agreed? Yes. We still need agreement from Guernsey and from Anguilla, but we hope that will come in the coming days. Second question, will our revenue have access to the register? Yes, they will. Her third question, are we going to force them to have public registers? We think they should. We think that's the right way to go. But let's be clear, very few countries in the world, I think Spain, Britain, and possibly one or two others have these public registers of beneficial ownerships. Our Crown dependencies, our overseas territories, will now be far in advance of most other countries. So instead of attacking them, we ought to praise them and thank them for what they've done.
Sir Alan Duncan.
Shouldn't the Prime Minister's critics really just snap out of their synthetic indignation and admit that their real point is that they hate anyone who's even got a hint of wealth in their life? So may I support the Prime Minister in fending off those who are attacking him, particularly in thinking of this place, because if he doesn't, we risk seeing a House of Commons which is stuffed full of low achievers who hate enterprise, hate people who look after their own family, and who know absolutely nothing about the outside world.
Well, I'm very grateful for my right honourable friend's support. We have a system of members' interests which was put in place at the end of 13 years of a Labour government. I think we should maintain that system. I don't want us to discourage people who've had a successful career in business or anything else in coming into this House and making a contribution. And that's why I've said, I think for Prime Ministers and Chancellors, Shadow Prime Ministers, Shadow Chancellors, it's a different set of arrangements.
Mr. Dennis Skinner.
Does the Prime Minister recall that at the time after he became Prime Minister under the Coalition, and at the time when he was dividing the nation between strivers and scroungers, I asked him a very important question about the windfall he received when he wrote off the mortgage of the premises in Notting Hill, and I said to him he didn't write off the mortgage of the one the taxpayers were helping to pay for at Oxford. I didn't receive a proper answer then. Maybe Dodgy Dave will answer it now. And by the way,
Order. I must ask the honourable gentleman, order. Don't require any assistance from some junior minister. An absurd proposition. I invite the honourable gentleman to withdraw that adjective that he used a moment ago. He's perfectly capable of asking his question without using that word. It is up to him, but if he doesn't wish to withdraw it, I can't reasonably ask the Prime Minister to answer the question. All he has to do is withdraw that word and think of another. Sorry? I think he knows the word beginning with D and ending in Y that he inappropriately used.
Davy.
Withdraw.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Very simple. Withdraw.
This man has done more to divide this nation than anybody else. He's looked after his own pocket. I still refer to him as Dodgy Dave. what you like.
Order. I'm sorry. I must ask the honourable gentleman to withdraw the word. Very well. Very well. Under the power given to me by Standing Order number 43, I order the honourable member to withdraw immediately from the House for the remainder of this day's sitting.
He's used to this.
Very well. Needless to say, no reply is required to that question. We will take next Sir Edward Lee.
Well, it's a very shocking scandal. We now know that the Prime Minister divested himself of all his shareholdings before he became Prime Minister and has paid his taxes in full.
Exactly. Shocking.
Shocking. But there is a wider question which I'd like to ask the Prime Minister about. It follows on the question from the Chairman of the Treasury Committee. As long as we have the longest tax code in the world after India, won't hard-working families always use legitimate ways of trying to minimise their tax bill? Some of us have been arguing for years for a flatter tax system to merge rates. Let me give him one suggestion. The best way to stop people avoiding paying inheritance tax, that iniquitous tax, is to abide by our manifesto commitment and abolish it.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for his support, and I would say we met our manifesto commitment on inheritance tax, which was to exempt the family home. He's right that we need to simplify, but there's things moving in different directions, which is, one, you want to simplify taxes, but on the other hand, where you see abuses occur, you sometimes need to write new tax code in order to make sure they can't be used, and that can lead to complications. But I'm well aware of his general point and think he's right.
Yvette Cooper.
Here. Could the Prime Minister now answer a question that both he and the Chancellor refused to answer a few years ago, and confirm that they both benefited personally from their cut to the top rate of tax, and on the day that universal credit cuts mean part-timers could be over £1,000 a year worse off, does he think that the several £1,000s a year in which they both benefited are fair?
Well, the information is contained in from my tax return. It's in the House of Commons library. Everyone can go and look at it. But the key point is this: since we reduced the top rate of tax from 50 to 45p, we've not only raised more revenue, which is money that we can spend on the public services I know that she supports, but actually the richest 1% in our country are paying a higher overall percentage of income tax at 27%.
Sir Nicholas Soames.
Would my right honourable friend clarify again that tens of millions of our fellow citizens benefit from tax-exempt investments, in that most pension schemes don't pay tax on their investment income, which directly benefits hard-working people saving for and receiving pensions?
Hear, hear.
No, my right honourable friend is absolutely right about that, but I'd also reinforce the point that millions of our fellow citizens own shares, and many people choose to make their investments through unit trusts, which are a relatively safe form of investment because they share the risk. Many of those unit trusts are listed in other countries, many of them now in Dublin, and they're set up there not to avoid tax, but to make sure that the revenues are returned to the unit trust holder and they then pay tax, and that's the key point.
Caroline Lucas.
Mr. Speaker, does he accept that the revelations last week that he personally intervened in 2013 to water down the effects of EU transparency rules over trusts does damage his efforts to portray himself as some kind of champion of fair tax? And will he now commit to fully support EU transparency rules, including country-by-country reporting by corporations, showing exactly how much profit they make and where?
Let me be absolutely clear with the Honourable Lady. There were no EU proposals. The whole thing was based on a British proposal, a British initiative to encourage all countries to have registers of beneficial ownership. The EU then joined in by suggesting extending it to trusts, and we pointed out that if that happened, no one would take up this proposal because trusts, as she knows, are set up for all sorts of reasons, the care of a disabled child or the support for a local school, any number of things perfectly reasonable under English common law. And the advice I had was that if we went for this proposal of going for beneficial ownership of companies and trusts, the move that we've made that is genuinely helping to change the world in this regard would have completely failed.
Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Mr. Speaker, would my right honourable friend encourage the Leader of the Opposition to write to him to set out in detail the allegations he makes against him, either of breaking the law or of propriety or the rules of this House? Because I have to say that having listened carefully to the Leader of the Opposition, I fail entirely to comprehend what it is he is going on about. And on a separate issue, I'm glad to see my right honourable friend stand up for the overseas territories. He will know that at the time when I was Attorney General, I had quite a lot of dealings with the attorneys of the overseas territories in encouraging them to change their transparency rules. And in fact, they showed themselves to be properly responsive to those representations. And you may also agree with me that the overseas territories are entitled to provide financial services and not to be damned for, in fact, trying to ensure the well-being of their own citizens.
No, well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right. What we've tried to do with the overseas territories is say there is a perfectly legitimate business of providing financial services, but they, like us, should be doing it on the basis of high standards, not low standards. I think that is an argument that they now accept and are carrying out, and we should thank them for it. As for the first half of his question, I listened to the right honourable gentleman. I'm not sure I want to read all about it again in a letter, because I don't think there's much to answer.
Mr. Gavin Robinson.
Mr. Speaker, you could be forgiven for believing that the only virtue is transparency. But privacy and equality are both important virtues that we value in this country. Does the Prime Minister agree that given the many thousands of opinion formers, policy formers and decision makers in this country paid publicly through private service companies, if we are to set any principle, it should be with public finance comes public transparency, who is paid what, by us, the taxpayer. If we can establish that principle first, then we can have a more wide discussion about transparency.
I agree with the first half of his question. There is a value in privacy, and that is why I think we have to have this balance between what is disclosed and what is not disclosed, and I've tried to set out the way forward today. On his issue about private service companies, the Chancellor had something to say about that in the budget, and I think there is a case, particularly where public money is involved, in making sure that people declare these arrangements in the proper way. But I think the changes the Chancellor has spoken about will make sure that whether someone chooses to have a private service company or chooses to be self-employed, the amount of tax they pay will be much more similar.
Sir Edward Garnier.
Thank you, sir. I welcome the Prime Minister's announcement that there will be a new criminal offence applying to corporations who fail to prevent their representatives from criminally facilitating tax evasion. That reflects the failure to prevent bribery offence already existing under the Bribery Act. There are nearly 40 other economic crimes which are listed in the Crime and Courts Act 2013 which are susceptible to deferred prosecution agreements. Will my right honourable friend have discussions with the Ministry of Justice and the law officers to make sure that we can not only add the tax offence that he is referring to, but those other economic crimes, so that they can be dealt with under the failure to prevent system?
Well, my right honourable friend has a lot of expertise in this area, and I think the point he's making is that we have to make sure, as we set out these economic crimes, and the Home Secretary has led the charge to make sure we address this issue properly, we make sure they're properly publicised, properly understood, and then properly prosecuted. And we need to make sure the National Crime Agency and the Serious Fraud Office work together in the way that I know he was keen when he was doing that job.
Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister says that he is leading on international efforts to crack down on tax evasion. So could the Prime Minister properly explain why he wrote to the then European Council President Herman Van Rompuy in 2013 and asked him to water down the impact of EU transparency rules by treating trusts differently from companies? by treating trusts differently from companies in anti-money laundering rules, despite warnings that such a move could create loopholes for tax dodgers.
With great respect to the honourable lady, I've answered this question several times, most recently to the leader of the Green Party, which is that we were keen to get progress on the beneficial ownership of companies. And if we'd accepted proposals to include trusts, that would have got completely bogged down and wouldn't have made nearly the progress that we have, where we've got every G7 country and most G20 countries signing up to having action plans on beneficial ownership of companies. If you do that with trusts, my advice was the whole thing would have slowed down to an absolute trickle and we wouldn't have got all the international cooperation and all the extra money we're going to raise.
Mr. Philip Davis.
Speaker, as far as I'm concerned, it's perfectly clear that neither the Prime Minister nor his father, for that matter, have done anything wrong at all. And in his statement he said, we must defend the right of every British citizen to make money lawfully. That's something which I agree with wholeheartedly. But it is slightly at variance to the description of people who have just done that as morally repugnant. So can the Prime Minister give us a promise that from now on he will uphold the rule of law and the view that the rule of law is what's important in this country and not question the morality of people who actually act lawfully with regard to their tax arrangements?
I'm very grateful for my honourable friend's support, and I agree what he says about the importance of enabling people to make money within the law, and he's completely right that the rule of law is what matters overall. The simple point I've often made and will continue to make is that, of course, it's tax evasion that is illegal, not tax avoidance. There are many ways that people avoid taxation, not least by putting money into a pension or into an ISA or into other perfectly legitimate ways of planning for their future and their family and all the rest of it. I would, though, say what we've seen sometimes is very, very aggressive measures. I mentioned some of them in my statement. People putting properties in envelopes, in company envelopes rather than paying stamp duty, where it's sometimes difficult for government to catch up quickly enough with the huge changes that are taking place. So I think a bit of leeway on that is necessary, but he's right. It's the rule of law that matters.
Mr. David Winnick.
Prime Minister realise there's a world of difference between the vast majority of our constituents who pay their tax, pay in the usual way, deducted at source and other means, and tax spivs, very rich tax spivs, who use tax havens for obvious reasons. That's why the accusation is made between them and those people that I've been referring to.
Of course, there is bad practice that takes place, not least in some of these jurisdictions, that needs to be dealt with, and that's what the tax transparency and the sharing of information and registers of beneficial ownership and all the rest are about. But I would say the other thing to recognise that happened last week is that the £11,000 personal allowance came in so people could earn £11,000 before they pay any income tax at all, and that completed our work of taking 4 million of the lowest paid people in our country out of income tax altogether.
Alok Sharma.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has paid his taxes, he has behaved perfectly properly, and could I commend him for standing up to those who have sought to besmirch his father's reputation and memory? Could the Prime Minister remind us how much extra money has come into the Exchequer as a result of his government's closing down the loopholes that were set up under 13 years of Labour government?
Well, the point is we have raised an extra 12 billion in the last Parliament. We want to raise another 16 billion in this Parliament, stretching out to 2021, the figures that I gave. But also by having a lower rate of corporation tax, we've actually seen more corporation tax come in. Low tax rates, but tax rates that people pay. Those are our watchwords.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
We have heard that the rule of law is paramount. The government controls what is legal and what is illegal in tax law. Can the Prime Minister guarantee that the law will make offshore tax dodging in all its forms illegal?
Evading tax is already illegal, whether you are doing it in the UK or somewhere else. The point I've been making is we do need to have this information sharing and the ability to look at information in these jurisdictions in order to see if people have been evading tax. And that is what we're now getting. But we shouldn't use that to say that it's wrong for people or trade unions or companies or pension schemes to invest in unit trusts listed in other countries, because that's a perfectly normal way of investing.
Berry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Speaker, can I congratulate my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, for bringing the transparency to the Office of Prime Minister by publishing his own tax return. Could he say whether he has any thoughts about whether this should be extended to former Prime Ministers, many of whom still receive public money? I personally would be very interested in seeing the tax return of one Mr T. Blair.
No proposals to make in that regard. Look, what I would say is, look, I'm not claiming some perfect record, but on becoming Prime Minister, I cut the Prime Minister's pay by 5% and froze it for the Parliament. I rejected the Prime Minister's tax allowance of £20,000 a year. I reformed the Prime Minister's pension so it's contributory for the first time. As Mr Speaker knows, Mr Speaker, the Lord Chancellor and the Prime Minister have all given up the great Office of State pension that gives you half your salary in perpetuity. Well, you say it was done by the Labour government. It wasn't actually brought in until I became Prime Minister. I did it, right? And so all of those steps have been taken, which I think are the right thing to do.
Margaret Ferrier.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Will the Chancellor of the Exchequer be clarifying the tax situation of his family company, Osborne and Little, which he holds shares in, but which has paid no UK corporation tax in 7 years?
Well, what I would say is that the Chancellor's family firm is exactly the sort of manufacturing small firm we want to encourage in our country. Now, for many years, I gather, they haven't been making a profit, but I'm glad that the company is doing well and now paying a dividend. That's something we should welcome. Its tax matters are entirely a matter between the company and the Inland Revenue, and that's the way it should be.
Wendy Morton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to join members on this side of the House in welcoming the Prime Minister's statement this afternoon. And I'd like to ask, when he meets with world leaders in London this May for the first global anti-corruption summit of its kind, will he press them to agree actions to expose corruption wherever it exists?
Well, I think it's good that we're having this summit. Look, as I am writing in a document that will be released before the summit, no country, no politician, no one can claim that they have a perfect and unblemished record in this regard. All countries are battling against these problems, as we did in this House of Commons with the problems of expenses and all the rest of it. But I want to encourage people, and the Prime Minister of Afghanistan is contributing, the President of Nigeria is contributing, and they are admitting that their countries are rife with corruption, but it needs to be dealt with. And the problem is, if nobody actually stands up and talks about these issues and sets out the action plans for delivering these issues, nothing will get done.
Mr David Lammy.
At the last count, 36,364 properties in London were owned by offshore companies. That's 1 in 10 of one London borough and 7% of another London borough. We should know who owns those properties. Many believe it's dirty money from countries like Russia and the Middle East. Driving up costs, 50% increase since 2007. What is the Prime Minister now going to do about dirty money propping up the London property market?
Well, the first thing that we've already done, and has had a huge impact, is to say that if a property is owned by a company in a so-called envelope structure, so you can't get to the name of the person who owns that property, they have to pay an annual stamp duty charge of something like 15%. And so this has been a massive money raiser to spend on public services and a huge disincentive for this sort of behaviour. But I want to go further. As I said in my speech in Singapore, we need to have more information about who owns what in our country.
In Latham.
Speaker, can I thank the Prime Minister for his very clear statement. This afternoon I've received a very furious email from Martin in my constituency, who said he watched Sky News' Moynihan show yesterday, and he's so shocked that the Shadow Chancellor deliberately misled viewers, and his ignorance, whether deliberate or not, should be exposed in Parliament, and I'm quoting him here. For a Shadow Chancellor to be so blatantly misleading is not acceptable. And I am quoting here, the Marxist morons' political motivation are obvious but not an excuse. The Prime Minister could not have paid inheritance tax even if he wished to. as taxes levied on the
Order.
estate must be paid prior to the grant of progress.
Order. Well, I'm extremely grateful to the Honourable Lady, but as the Clerk has just pointed out to me, this is all very well, but it's nothing to do with the responsibility of the Prime Minister. Prime Minister is not... No, order. Order. Don't argue with the Chair. That's not a wise course of action. The Prime Minister is not responsible for what the Shadow Chancellor has said. I do say that to the Honourable Lady kindly, but with some authority in these matters, believe me. Alison McGovern.
Speaker, no one in this House should have to feel family members are being attacked unfairly. And in that, the Prime Minister is absolutely correct. Can I tell him, though, it's not clear to me what he believes about holding shares in offshore trust in tax havens. Does he think it's perfectly okay, in which case, why would his holding them have been a conflict of interest? Or does he think that tax havens are a problem that need fixing, in which case, why did he have them in the first place?
Yes. That's a very good question. Let me answer it in full, because I think it's very important. Do I think it's okay to own shares in a unit trust that's registered in another country, whether that's in Dublin or in Guernsey or elsewhere? Yes, I do. And that is why trade unions hold those shares, companies hold those shares, pension funds, many, many people in our country hold unit trusts, because, and here's the key point, is that the unit trust does not exist to make money for itself. It makes money for the unit holders, and if the unit holders live in Britain, they pay British tax, British income tax, British capital gains tax, and all the rest of it. And that's why these arrangements have been in place for many years. No Labour government, no Labour policy review, no Conservative policy review has ever thought of getting rid of them. It's important they're administered and run in the proper way, but that's my answer to her first question. A second question is, why, if I thought there was nothing wrong with a holding like that, did I sell my shares because there might be a conflict of interest? I sold shares in every company that I owned because I thought there were two options. You can either put things into a blind trust, as ministers in Labour or Conservative governments have done. Nothing wrong with that. Very good way to go about it. But I thought maybe even simpler and more straightforward was just sell everything, so that, because then I would not own any shares. So if any of the companies that I'd previously had a shareholding in any way had dealings with the government, there was no way that even if someone could look inside a blind trust, they could find any conflict of interest. That's why I sold the shares. I happen to think it was quite a sensible thing to do.
Oliver Dowden.
Will the Prime Minister confirm that the only irregular thing about the summary of his tax return is the fact that he voluntarily and privately forsook the £20,000 Prime Ministerial tax-free allowance, something that was enjoyed by many of his predecessors, including those opposite? Instead, he rightly focused on increasing the personal allowance so that millions of low-income earners could avoid paying tax altogether, and will he pledge to continue that policy?
Well, I'm very grateful to give my honourable friend that reassurance. We have the target in our manifesto of a £12,500 personal tax allowance, and we want to meet that. And I think what I did as Prime Minister was the right thing, not least because, as it says in the information for my tax return, there is support for me and my wife from the Conservative Party in terms of some of the costs and issues of travel and other things that you have to deal with as the leader of a party. And I thought that was a better way of doing it. Party, not taxpayers' money, but party money on which I pay a tax charge.
John Mann.
Is it the right thing to do to be claiming expenses to live in a grace and favour apartment and at the same time to be making a big profit out of your own main home?
Well, I'm rather baffled by the Honourable Gentleman. I'm a little bit baffled by the Honourable Gentleman because he announced over the weekend he was going to refer me to the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, so I pitched up there, one of my office pitched up there this morning with all the information necessary, only to hear that he hasn't actually yet made a complaint. So I hope he's going to find the time later on and do what he said he was going to do. Look, the point, I think he's misunderstood. I am very lucky to live in number 10 Downing Street, actually precisely number 11 and 12 Downing Street, and as a result of that, I receive a benefit in kind, and because of that benefit in kind, calculated at I think some £7,000, I pay a tax on that benefit on kind for living in the house. So it's not a subsidy I'm getting, it's a benefit which I'm very grateful for, and I give the taxman money in respect of it.
Mr. Michael Fabricant.
But may I tell the Prime Minister that he should not be ashamed that he has the good fortune to be born into a well-off family. He has nothing to be ashamed about. May I tell the Prime Minister it's not a sin for his parents, quite naturally, to want their savings to be cascaded down through the generations. He is nothing to be ashamed of. But can I warn my right honourable friend, no matter how much information he wants to divulge, nothing will satisfy some of those people on the Labour front bench.
I'm very grateful for what my honourable friend says. I think there is a point at which you have to say, I've published the information that I think is relevant. I've gone back over the last 6 years. But that's the limit of what I'm going to release. Some people say, well, what about your wife's tax return? Or what about your mother's financial affairs? Or all the rest of it. I really think there comes a time when we should say we have a register of members' interests. Prime ministers and chancellors and opposition leaders and shadow chancellors have done more than that, and we should rely on the register of members' interests to police the rest of our affairs.
Streeting.
Given that more than half of the companies implicated in the Panama leaks are registered in UK overseas territories and Crown dependencies, does the Prime Minister regret telling this House in 2013, I do not think it's fair any longer to refer to any of the overseas territories or Crown dependencies as tax havens? And could he try and rebuild some of the public trust that he's lost in the last week by making sure that, particularly in terms of publishing information about beneficial ownership, that Crown dependencies and overseas territories do follow the UK's example? And will he take concrete action by putting this at the centre of the agenda of his own anti-corruption summit next month?
Well, the reason I made that statement in 2013 is we'd got the Crown dependencies and the overseas territories for the first time to share automatically tax information with the United Kingdom government. That is something that didn't happen under the last Labour government, something that we did achieve. It was a different approach, but now he's right, we want to go further, and the announcement today is not only will they share that information and have the common reporting standard, but they're going to give us access to their information about beneficial ownership. Just so he knows how different things were under the last government, the then Financial Secretary of the Treasury, in response to questions about the overseas territories, said this: the negotiation of tax information exchange agreements with other jurisdictions, including the UK, is essentially a matter for the Crown dependencies themselves. I.e., he was saying, nothing to do with me, Gov, it's up to them. Well, that is the government that we replaced, and we took a different approach, and we've made a lot of progress.
Mr. Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Forgive my lack of voice. Can I also say I totally understand the Prime Minister's predicament and his instinct to protect his father, and I would have done exactly the same. And his father did nothing wrong whatsoever. The Prime Minister mentioned a long and thoughtful debate will come. Can I say most gently that when public figures get into trouble, that in future there are no more knee-jerk reactions, and that a long and thoughtful debate is given to avoid unnecessary consequences for everybody else?
No, I think my honourable friend, first of all, thank you for his support, but he makes an important point, which we should try to make decisions about these things calmly and rationally after debate. I felt, after all the questions I was being asked, the right thing to do was to publish this information, but I couldn't have been clearer today that I don't want to see that as some precedent that every member of this House, or indeed every member of this my cabinet, has to follow. I think we should think very carefully. We've always had a system in this country based on full disclosure to the revenue, but taxpayer confidentiality. Now, some other countries do have complete publication of all tax returns and all tax information. That hasn't been our way. We've had a different system, and I don't think we should give it up lightly.
Caroline Flint.
Speaker, it saddens me that the MP for Rutland and Melton seems to suggest that if you weren't a millionaire, you were a low achiever. Speaking as a low achiever, the biggest multinational company earns more income in a single week than the combined incomes of all MPs put together. Now, the Prime Minister has spoken about transparency before and today, and that is why many of us across this House from all parties want to make sure that the country-by-country information that multinationals will be obliged to provide to HMRC should be put in the public domain. Will he or a minister meet with myself and other members of the Public Accounts Committee to discuss this proposal?
Hear, hear.
I've always thought of the Honourable Lady as a high achiever. She certainly put the boot into my predecessor more effectively than I ever did. I remember that very well. The point about the... the point about the... No, not that one. The point about the country-to-country reporting is what we're trying to achieve, as I said in my statement, is a common reporting standard so that companies report to tax authorities in the same way, and then the sharing of that information so you can see if company A is paying X amount of tax in one jurisdiction and Y amount in the other, and that's not right, then you can do something about it. Now, I think that at the moment is the most powerful way of achieving what we want to achieve. There are those who say we need to go even further in public declarations of tax. I think it's a very interesting argument, but let's not make the best the enemy of the good. We've got a very solid way now of making sure these companies pay tax properly, and I want to see that completed.
Mr. David Nuttall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that any course of action designed to reduce tax which does not constitute tax evasion must by definition be legal, even if some may regard it as aggressive tax avoidance, and it is up to this Parliament to legislate to make such courses of action illegal?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. Where there is aggressive avoidance taking place that is clearly against the spirit of the law, then Parliament should act. And as I've said many times, that's what the Chancellor has done. That's what HMRC advises us about. I think sometimes there are occasions when the tax avoidance is so aggressive that it is right to warn those taking part in it that legislation will follow, and so therefore they shouldn't take part in the scheme in the first place, and that often happens too.
Blair Donaldson.
Sir has described the tax arrangements being discussed today as standard practice and normal. Assuming we are still all in this together, will he be issuing guidance, perhaps in the form of a leaflet to every UK household, so ordinary taxpayers can find out how they too can benefit from offshore tax havens?
Well, the point is that there are many people in our country, I think there are over now 12.5 million shareholders, many of whom hold shares in things like unit trusts. There's plenty of information about them. They don't need any from me. But the point is, if you invest in one of those, if you're a UK resident, you must pay UK income tax and UK capital gains tax, just as you're buying a share in any other organisation.
Mr. Robert Jenrick.
Speaker, I wouldn't recommend doing this, but reading back through Hansard over the last 13 years of the Labour government, I couldn't find a single occasion on which the member for Islington North raised any of these issues. The closest he came, Mr. Speaker, was when he described the Labour government's decision to use orders in council to take control of the Turks and Caicos Islands as medieval and extremely undemocratic, a policy he now advocates for all territories. Isn't it fortunate that we had a government after 2010 who actually took up this agenda?
I'm interested to see the right honourable gentleman conducted a U-turn, because recently he's been suggesting taking control of these territories. I can now see a use for the nuclear submarines as they head off towards the Isle of Man, as the Corbyn invasion force begins to mass to take over this territory. Much more sensible to get them to do the things they ought to be doing.
Liz Kendall.
Why does the Prime Minister think so many companies are registered in Panama in the first place? Why not London or New York?
The reason why a lot of unit trusts register in different countries, and a number of them have been named right now, many of them are registering in Dublin, is that they want to be able to market their services not simply to UK residents who pay UK taxes, but to other people. And that is why, actually, if you look at the Inland Revenue, the way they arrange this, they actually want to make sure that UK fund managers can be involved and pay their taxes here in the UK, and we can build the investment industry that this country can rightly be proud of.
Mr. Andrew Bridgen.
Speaker, can I thank my right honourable friend for his open and frank statement today? And I think that any reasonably minded person, he's completely exonerated himself. Can he confirm that under HMRC rules, all the supporting documentation for a tax return should be retained for 7 years? And since the Leader of Opposition was late supplying his tax return, should he be fined?
Well, there's obviously no fine for the fact that he didn't come to the House having already published it, although it was disappointing that we got it at 3:35, I think, when I was on my feet. But obviously matters for fines of late production of tax returns, I think that's a matter for the HMRC.
Paul Flynn.
2013, his colleague Lord Blaine Cathborough was found guilty of an egregious breach of the Commons rules and the House of Lords rules for misleading a committee of inquiry in 2011 and for taking £10,000 a month as a payment for lobbying for the Cayman Islands. He had no punishment from his party and was allowed to get away with it with a brief apology to the House of Lords. Will the Prime Minister tell us that if in future any parliamentarian in his party uses his privileged position and prostitutes it in order to make private gain, he will act and discipline them?
Well, I think the point is we have now rules in this House for the declaration of members' interests. We have a policeman, as it were, in terms of making sure they're properly carried out. And then we do have punishments, including expulsion, for misdeclarations and misbehaviour. I'm not as familiar with the situation in the House of Lords, but I think they've been moving in the same direction, and that's all to the good.
Ben Howlett.
Speaker, whilst the conversations around Panama are interesting, no doubt, to the front bench of the opposition, reality check here, most of my constituents who are struggling to get on the property ladder actually benefit from inheritance tax. Benefit from inheritance as a result of a lot of the changes that happened under the previous Parliament. Does my honourable friend agree with me that the time is now to further reform inheritance tax to help more people, mainly my age, get on the property ladder?
Well, I think there is a role for making sure that people can pass on the family home exempt from inheritance tax, and that's why we've set out the steps during this Parliament to make sure that can happen. That completes what was set out in our manifesto.
Live effort.
I think the public would be more inclined to take the Prime Minister at his word when he wants to clamp down on tax avoidance. Had his government not appointed Edward Troop as Executive Chair of Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs in 2012. Now, this is someone who said taxation is legalised extortion and is valid only to the extent of the law. Can the Prime Minister say what source of money he got to pay Mr. Troop? And does someone with those views belong in the HMRC?
Well, Edward Troop is a dedicated public servant who works for the Inland Revenue, does a very good job. As I think the report in the papers point out this morning, he had a commercial career at Simmons & Simmons, one of the most respected city legal practices that there is. And frankly, it's a good thing if we can attract people from private practice into the Revenue and Customs to make sure we collect all the money we should.
Mark Spencer.
Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister assure the House that in future any changes to taxation will do nothing to diminish the aspiration of working families, so that those families who want to do the right thing, provide for their future, save for their retirement and pass something on to their children, can continue to do that?
I think my honourable friend is absolutely right. If you look at our reforms to inheritance tax, if you look at our reforms to pensions, we're enabling people to take and spend more of their own money as they choose. They're also able to pass it on to their children and to help with those key purchases, the first home, the first car, helping young people with their families. All of that, wealth cascading down the generations and helping people to do that is absolutely part of our goal.
On break.
Of course, the Prime Minister's announcement that people be criminalised if they assist with tax evasion, particularly as it was announced by the then Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Liberal Democrat Danny Alexander. Will the Prime Minister revisit other Liberal Democrat proposals put forward in coalition to see if they can also play a significant role in dealing with the really difficult issue of tax evasion?
No, it's certainly true that the coalition government achieved a lot in this area. It was led by myself and the Second Lord of the Treasury in terms of driving this agenda, but particularly at the G8 and the G20. But at the time, we did have the full support of our coalition partners.
Helen Whately.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome my right honourable friend's statement today, and I listened carefully to the words of the Leader of the Opposition. But does the Prime Minister share my concern that the Leader of the Opposition seemed to forget, or possibly was he unaware, that aspiration, that determination and the prospect of eventual financial reward are ingredients of the strong economy that we have, which lead to jobs and incomes for many? And does my right honourable friend agree that we should condemn these politics of envy? And will he stick to the politics of opportunity and aspiration?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. What we want is an aspiration and enterprise society where we set low tax rates, we encourage people to make the best of themselves and for their families, and that will actually build not just a stronger economy, but in my view, a stronger society too.
Gapes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister referred to his anti-corruption summit. Can he tell us which countries are going to be represented there? And will an invitation be extended to either President Putin or some of his corrupt cronies and those who fund the RT propaganda channel to explain the $2 billion held in Panama by that corrupt regime?
The honourable gentleman has been restored to rude health. I welcomed him earlier, and I know the Prime Minister will welcome him. The Prime Minister.
Very glad to see him back in his familiar place. I think it's fair to say the guest list is still being worked on for the corruption summit. But the point is this: we will be asking people on the basis not that they run perfect countries or perfect governments, but that are they going to commit to public declarations of things like open beneficial ownership registration, sharing tax information, making sure that when assets are looted that we can confiscate them and restore them to the people who they belong to. If countries want to sign up to that, however much their record in the past may have been imperfect, we'll be encouraging them to come and do just that.
Mark Menzies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My mother spent 32 years working in an ICI factory. But like the Prime Minister's mother, she's 81. Like the Prime Minister's mother, she's lost her husband. Like the Prime Minister's mother, she wants to hand some of that money down to the next generation. So can I say how deeply hurtful those remarks must have been to the Prime Minister over the last few days? And Mr. Speaker, what I would urge is the Prime Minister can tell the House what message we want to send to the millions of people in all of our constituencies who want to do the right thing by the next generation.
Well, I'm very grateful for my honourable friend's remarks, and I'm sure my mother will be too. She said, like me, she's developing a thicker skin with every week that goes past. But he's absolutely right. Many people want to pass wealth and assets and help their children and help them in all the ways they can, and that's not something we should be ashamed of. It's something we should actively encourage. It's something that can help to build the strong society that we want to see in our country.
McKinnell.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister acknowledged in his statement that under current legislation it is difficult to prosecute companies that assist with tax evasion. I and many others, including the Right Honourable Member for Harborough, would add fraud and corruption to that list too. The Government made a promise in its manifesto to extend the new corporate offence to deal with all economic crime, not just tax evasion. So would the Prime Minister commit today to urgently review the current position to only extend that offence to tax evasion, but an offence that will incorporate fraud and corruption too?
Well, the Honourable Lady is making a very interesting suggestion, and I'll look at it carefully. We've announced this proposal. We've identified that there will be an opportunity in the gracious speech to include this in a future bill, and we can look at that time about whether there is, I think what she's arguing for is an extension and tidying up of the offences so that they can be used in the same way, and I'll look very carefully at what she suggests.
Order. I'm sorry to disappoint remaining colleagues, but we've had a very full exchange, and we must now move on to the second statement.